All right, welcome and thank you for joining us today for this webinar. I am Beatrice Dupuy. I'm the director of Circle, and joining me today are Kate Mackay, Circle's associate director, and Marisol Aguirre, outreach coordinator. Both of them will be monitoring the webinar behind the scenes. All right, so we are at the top of the hour, so it's time to get started, and with a few announcements first. So Circle is one of 16 language resource centers funded under Title VI by the U.S. Department of Education, and it is housed here in the College of Humanities at the University of Arizona. Our mission is to develop and provide quality instructional materials and professional learning opportunities that are grounded in research. So for more information about what we do, the resources that we offer, please visit the links at the bottom of this slide. So here on this map, you can see where all the language resource centers are located in the United States. So we have several events coming up that I'd like to bring to your attention. So the first one is the new series that Circle will be hosting in April, May, and June. It is entitled Transforming Language Teaching Materials from Selection and Adaptation to Creation and Successful Implementation. Our second speaker for this series will be Adriana Diaz, who will be talking to us about the evolving landscape of language instructional material. Please scan the QR code or visit the link on this slide to get more information. On May 7, we have another webinar, which will be led by Peter Ecker, who is professor of German studies here at the University of Arizona. His webinar is entitled Empowering High School and College Students to Learn and Maintain Languages for Life through Courses on Multilingualism. This is a project which was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. So for more information, please scan the QR code or visit the link provided on this slide. The CFP for our upcoming ICC is available and the submission portal is open. Proposals are already coming in, and for more information, you can scan the QR code or visit the link on this slide. This summer, from June 2nd to June 5th, Kathy Short and her colleagues will lead a 4-day in-person institute for K-8 educators who will engage in experiences and books that invite children to immerse themselves in literature about refugee and immigrant experiences. So today's webinar is the first in the 3-part series that I mentioned earlier, and our presenter today is Dr. Heather Willis Allen. Dr. Allen is Associate Professor of French in the Department of French and Italian at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She teaches undergraduate French culture and writing courses and graduate courses in applied linguistics. Her publications include a Multiliteracies framework for collegiate foreign language teaching, Alliage culturel, la société française en transformation, and educating the future foreign language professoriate for the 21st century. Her forthcoming book, A Design Orientation to Second Language Writing Instruction, will be published as part of the Routledge Multiliteracies and Second Language Education series and will be available this coming summer. With no further ado, Heather, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Beatrice, for the kind introduction and the opportunity to present my work today. And I also wanted to thank Kate and Marisol for their amazing behind-the-scenes collaboration on the logistics for this presentation. Finally, I want to thank all of you who are tuning in today for this webinar. It's amazing to see where you're tuning in from all over the world, and I'm really grateful that each of you made the time today or tonight, depending on where you are coming from, for this opportunity to learn more about the use of multiliteracies pedagogy in language courses. I wanted to speak to a minute about Beatrice has introduced me, but also to mention some of the ways that I have interacted with textbook materials over the years. I've worked as a language program director since 2002, and I've supervised many multi-section university level French language courses. And I've also, on the other side of the spectrum, worked as a co-author of textbooks. So I'm familiar on one hand with the classroom sort of dynamics of working with textbooks, and also some of the dynamics and constraints that textbook authors are faced with as they design commercially available instructional materials. I want to start by providing an overview of where we are going in the webinar today, give a little bit of an idea of how this will be organized. I will begin by providing a bit of background on textbook materials in language education. And during this first part of the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to participate in 2 polls to share your ideas and opinions. Then we will move on in the second part of the webinar to discussing multiliteracies pedagogies and the principles and main concepts at play there. We'll then take a break, and I'll give you a couple of minutes to ask questions and make comments. And then the final section of the webinar, I will provide an instructional example of how we have integrated or woven together textbook materials and multiliteracies pedagogy in our intermediate French curriculum here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I work. But first, I want to spend a moment as we start to dive into these topics to define what I mean by a textbook in the context of this webinar and in terms of where we are at with textbooks in 2025. When I say textbook, I'm referring to print or digital educational materials that have been planned and produced and appear as a finished commercial product with the intention of being used by teachers and students. In some cultural contexts, they're referred to as course books or manuals. And as we all know, textbooks today are often not limited to physical books, but they can even be called like a textbook system, a textbook package, or a textbook platform. So back in 2009, an article here in the United States in the New York Times predicted, and I quote the article here, that while textbooks had not gone the way of the scroll yet, it will not be long before they are replaced by lessons assembled from the wealth of free courseware, games, videos, and projects on the web. But now, 16 years later, commercial textbooks have not disappeared, although the publishing landscape is much changed today in comparison to 2009. And teachers do have increasing access in language education to open educational resources, or OER, as well as a plethora of other free, authentic digital resources in all modalities. What I'd like to start our discussion then is with your conceptualizations of what textbooks represent or how they function in the courses that you teach. In a moment, we will put up a poll, and I'll ask you to finish the sentence that you see on the screen, and also to limit your response to 4 words or less.
Sure. So there are 29 responses so far. So resources, or a resource comes up multiple times. As a source of inspiration, as a guide for students, providing course structure. Somebody says it's a complementary text, it's a general guide, an extra thing that we have. So, but resource is probably the term that comes up most. It's another toolbox it's another tool in my toolbox. It's expensive. It's an expensive and awkward hindrance. A basic framework.
I'm going to switch gears and look at what some of the conceptualizations of textbooks are that have appeared in the research over the years. So you can see kind of how our responses are comparing to those. So these kind of fall into three general categories as I looked over about the past 30, 40 years of conceptualizations. The first are metaphors that suggest textbooks represent foundational knowledge for the course. You see words like bedrock from Kramsch or cornerstone. So meaning that textbooks function as a comprehensive compilation of content, the primary resource, or as kind of an authoritative overview of what should be covered in a given course. As Chappell wrote in 2016, regardless of all efforts toward formulating culture theory and curriculum frameworks, the culture textbook remains the cornerstone of the language course at the beginning level. It provides the basis for the syllabus, the springboard for other activities, guidance for new teachers, and socialization into the practice of language teaching and learning for students. So in this sort of theme, we see the textbook as a really foundational, critical role in grounding the course. Second, another recurrent theme highlights the reality that no textbook is neutral in the sense that textbooks are a reflection of certain prerogatives, identities, and cultures. As Claire Kramsch pointed out, like any work of art, the textbook is a construct, one that represents the way the author and publisher conceive of language, culture, and learning, and the way they construe an integrated world of foreign reality for instructional purposes. A textbook is not the authentic experience, but is a culturally coded educational construct. Right? So this really amplifies that idea that even though textbooks can kind of, be written for no specific audience and sometimes don't foreground the identity and prerogatives of the authors, that they really are a construct that reflect ideologies. Finally, and this third theme is what I heard the most in terms of this audience's conceptualizations of textbooks. And this is kind of at the other end of the spectrum from this first theme, is that textbooks can function as a resource to use selectively rather than a script to be followed. This perspective points to the role of teacher agency, of teacher priorities, when the textbook serves as a starting point from which educators build on other materials and priorities. So building on this idea of how textbooks are used, I want us to complete a second poll. And for this one, you'll be asked how useful textbook materials are for a variety of purposes. So here you can go ahead and rate each element of the textbook that you use on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being not useful, 0 being not at all useful, and 10 being very useful. Great. Okay. So I think we're starting to see some tendencies here, right? If we look at those averages, which you can see in the colored bubbles, we have the perception that the most useful functions of textbook materials are for presenting lexicogrammatical content, for practicing or using new lexicogrammatical structures. And on the other end of the spectrum, the least useful, in your opinion, is for learning and engaging in those cultural elements, as well as engaging in interpersonal communication. All right, very, very interesting. Well, I think you're going to see some alignment then between your perceptions as well as what researchers have to say. So some of the limitations of textbooks that come up often in the literature, the first one is cost, right? And this one is probably pretty obvious for anyone who has priced out a textbook package in recent years. The U.S. Department of Education published in 2017-18 the figure $1,471 as the average annual spending for US college students for instructional materials. Now, 100% of that is not spent on textbooks, but the lion's share likely is. So cost can be a real limitation of purchasing textbook materials that are sometimes not used for more than a couple of months. Second, relevance. This is the idea that textbooks, by design, are written for everyone and no one, and thus reflect a sort of one-size-fits-all approach. Textbook content may lack personal connection or appeal for a given group of students. Publishers tend to avoid taboo topics that may be relevant for students, as they probably want to avoid the risk of offending customers and negatively impacting sales. The third limitation of textbooks, and this is probably the #1 critique that you see discussed in the literature, is that cultural and cross-cultural representations and lack of meaningful opportunities for learners to engage with second language cultures are frequent in textbook content. McConaughey summarized this idea well, writing, "An increasing number of language textbooks have come to incorporate descriptions of foreign cultures with the intent of stimulating interest in the language and facilitating intercultural understanding. However, as has been discussed in previous research, descriptions tend to be simplistic, ethnocentric, and assume homogeneity amongst users of a language. It is not uncommon to find culture framed exclusively in terms of national cultures and reduced to stereotypical characterizations, which are presented as though they are facts." The final limitation that's been pointed up in research are that they tend to reflect outdated approaches and assumptions about language learners and language acquisition. Despite much progress toward and even beyond communicative and proficiency-based approaches, many textbooks still put a primary focus on mastery of grammar constructs, and they reflect a view of language learning as a matter of practicing new structures and habit formation by producing correct sentences and avoiding errors. As Zapata pointed out, textbooks may offer few opportunities for learners' active use of the language for meaningful and purposeful communication, and due to their reliance on mostly linguistic resources for multimodal meaning making. And I think we saw that reflected a little bit in your responses to that poll when you said, for example, that textbook materials tend to be less useful for interpersonal language use. These drawbacks have led some researchers to call for change. For example, Ana Lopez Sanchez, and I'll give you a moment here to read this quote. In their 2016 book, Ana Lopez Sanchez wrote the quote that you see here, and I find that this is a really critical point, not only for language students in terms of the focus of elementary and intermediate courses are, but also in terms of their readiness and their motivation to continue into those advanced level culture, language, and literature courses. So now let's turn to the pedagogical focus of this webinar and how it can complement textbook materials. Multiliteracies. What does it mean to embrace this perspective? So as you see, Paisani and Mankey wrote that the study of language and texts should be integrated at all curricular levels, right? That we want to integrate instead of separate the linguistic modalities. As Kern additionally wrote, multiliteracies is not just using language to practice vocabulary and structures, but also to explore a different world and to relate that world to your own thinking and experience. It is about engaging in real literacy events, not just rehearsing reading and writing skills. So let's dig a little more into this idea of multiliteracies or multiple literacies and talk about what this means. New literacy studies scholars typically describe this word or the part of the word, the multi part, in terms of two concepts. First, literacies are multidimensional. About literacy having three dimensions. And for me, this is a very useful and clear concept for thinking about course and curricular design. Developing the linguistic dimension of literacy has long been the focus of language education, and it remains an essential element of literacy-based instruction. The linguistic dimension includes knowledge related to lexicogrammatical features of language, as well as the ability to understand and produce features of language and apply conventions together to create phrases, sentences, and paragraphs. The other two dimensions of literacy, depending on the instructional approach and context, have been less present in language education. The cognitive dimension entails the ability to access existing knowledge and to establish connections between different pieces of information to create and transform new knowledge, as well as the use of mental processes and strategies to construct meaning. The cognitive dimension also includes reflection and self-reflection on language learning and language use. Finally, the sociocultural dimension of literacy involves an awareness of the dynamic nature of culture and the ways in which culture influences how we think and communicate. The multi and multiliteracies can also refer to multimodality. As Anstey and Bull explained, when producing or consuming a multimodal text, students need knowledge of the semiotic systems used, their codes and conventions, together with an understanding of what to consider when combining them together in a text. So you see an example on your screen, right, of a very simple, very kind of common multimodal text. It was one that I ran into recently when I was perusing Instagram. So it talked about 6 emblematic places to experience the Francophone world in Paris. And it was a very interesting way to quickly learn about these places. There were videos, music, images, text, all mixed together. So you have lots of different semiotic modes of meaning making that are combined. These semiotic systems can include audio, gestural, linguistic, and spatial meaning making resources. In language materials, we really tend to focus, though, on the linguistic resources, right? And maybe the audio mode, but there's some of these modes of meaning making that get overlooked. So multiliteracies kind of tries to shine a brighter light on the fact that in the everyday world and our common uses of communication today, using digital devices, that knowing how to make meaning in a multimodal way is important. And it should be important in the classroom as well. What does it entail to take up a multiliteracies perspective in course design? The first is thinking about aligning learning outcomes with a multiliteracies approach, right? So conceptualizing learning as engagement and meaning making, not just practicing structures. And using those modes of communication, interpersonal, presentational, interpretive communication, to integrate, to weave together rather than to separate into 4 skills. And finally, to prioritize textual learning as a vehicle for communicative language use and learning about second language cultures. So how can teachers work toward those learning goals? First, by prioritizing meaning design in the classroom and in the types of assignments that are used. In designing meaning, instead of a set of distinct skills to be mastered, the modalities of reading, writing, listening, and speaking are interrelated. They overlap and complement one another. Meaning design encourages engagement in multimodal communication. This brings us then to the how of multiliteracies pedagogy, or the instructional moves used to implement this approach. In multiliteracies pedagogy, these are referred to as knowledge processes. So as you see on the screen, these are the 4 knowledge processes: experiencing, conceptualizing, analyzing, and applying. In experiencing activities, learners are immersed in language use through communicative activities using text. There is no conscious reflection here on language forms, but instead, learners experience language use as they express thoughts, feelings, opinions. For example, learners might interpret an image in an advertisement based on their views and experiences. Or they may demonstrate comprehension of a text by ordering a list of its main ideas. In conceptualizing activities, learners develop knowledge to explicitly identify and use new linguistic resources and conventions for meaning design. These activities are not mechanical, right? So they're not drills, but instead they involve having learners unpack, explore the content of text. So that might be language forms, genre conventions, or textual organization, for example. Some examples of conceptualizing activities are identifying what linguistic forms could typically be used in a given genre, or completing a graphic organizer to map word or syntax relationships in a text. In analyzing activities, learners focus on understanding the contexts surrounding a text that undergird its content. So that might be cultural or historical or ideological. Learners also gain awareness of how rules of communication in the foreign language function and how they're tied to specific contexts and communities of use. Finally, in applying activities, students have opportunities to apply what they've learned for creating new texts or for reshaping existing ones. This may take a more creative dimension or be a more straightforward knowledge application. I'm going to move now to how these concepts from multiliteracies pedagogy relate to textbook use. And I'm going to draw on some examples from an elementary French textbook that we have used in our language program at UW-Madison to illustrate each of the knowledge processes. So on the right side of your screen now, what you see is the cover page of the first chapter of this book. So one thing that you can do as an instructor, when you're thinking about materials evaluation, course and curriculum design, is to kind of look at these chapter level objectives or look at your table of contents and think about, what is being prioritized here? Okay, so as you see in these larger blue letters, themes and communication. So this book has a very communicative focus. Then next you have some grammatical structures and associated vocabulary. And we can start to think here about how these different components, whether it be the cultural component, okay, they're introducing us to France and the Francophone world. How might that map onto those knowledge processes? Can I use this material to carry out activities and learning that aligns with multiliteracies? So let's look at now some more specific examples for each of the 4 knowledge processes, starting with experiencing. And again, I'm just pulling a sample activity each time or sample material from this textbook chapter. So experiencing. Experiencing involves collaboration among students to describe, explore, react, and compare knowledge and perspectives. And this is should be a really important part of experiencing activities. There are different types of experiencing activities, right? So the first kind of category is experiencing the known, starting with what students know, what they've experienced in their lived realities. And that takes on typically a more interpersonal flavor. And then moving to experiencing the new. So introducing them to new textual content, thematic textual content, then going to comprehension checking activities, and then probably moving towards some more analyzing activities, which I'll share that part with you in a moment. So here's a sample from the book. And keeping in mind, this is very simple. This is just the first chapter of the book. It says, you probably don't know everyone in your class, so let's, exchange information with our neighbors. Sit next to someone you don't know, right? So it's this model here in French says, hello, what's your name? And then the partner says, oh, my name is Alan. Where do you live? I live in. Where are you from? I am from, right? So exchanging personal information. This kind of activity does align well with experiencing. A suggestion I would have to make it even more multiliteracy focused would be to be sure to provide robust linguistic support for communication here. Maybe we want to add in some conversational gambits so it doesn't feel quite as mechanical, right? Providing a little bit of extra vocabulary to students like, oh, really? Or cool, or I see, just making the conversation seem a little more interpersonal, a little more natural. Teachers could also add on sort of a part 2 for this. Maybe they put up a map of the world on the overhead projector and kind of map where people live in their country, where students are from their country or from around the world, since most of our language courses have an international student population. So that would be an example of an experiencing activity and how you might adapt it, modify it just a little bit to pull it a little more in line with the multiliteracies pedagogy. So next, conceptualizing. As you mentioned, when we polled you, textbooks tend to do a great job in general with presenting lexicogrammatical content. As you see here, we have on the right side of the screen, textbook material that presents the days of the week, the months of the year, the seasons, okay? And then just under the presentation of this material, you have 2 activities that ask students to give dates. So it has items such as the national holiday in your country, your birthday, the first day of summer, the date tomorrow, the date today. Okay, so a little bit of exchange there can happen among or between students. And then you have a second activity that has students use numbers as well as this new vocabulary. So this gets students to do some basic exchange of this type of information. But I think what is needed in terms of what can be added on to improve this type of textbook content would be to link it to some textual meaning making, right? Or link it to textual content that might give students the opportunity to explore the second language culture. So there could be lots of different ways to do that, but some ways that came to mind for me would be, going online and finding some calendars from one of the second language cultures, or maybe going on to, I don't know, I have children, so I'm often on an app that looks at school lunches, right? Maybe go on to a calendar that has the days and the months and some kind of cultural content like that, or looking at the differences and similarities between the academic year in the culture where you're teaching versus a different second language culture. right? So taking it to a cultural level instead of just keeping it at the level of practicing the use of new cultures, using conceptualizing as a jumping off point to get to some authentic textual content. Okay. The third knowledge process, analyzing. So analyzing involves activities that have learners question what is learned from the text they are reading, listening to, and viewing, and even having the opportunity to relate it back to their own culture. So for example, in this textbook chapter, we had some really nice cultural content that showed students maps of the Francophone world, provided them some factual information about those maps, and checked comprehension really well in a simple format as to whether students understood some of the main ideas and even some of the details from this text. What is less present typically in so these type of activities that you see on the screen, 1-35 and 1-36 under the map, those are really more like experiencing activities. They're giving students first and foremost experience and practice in reading and interpretation, right? So they're very good at giving that opportunity to read, to kind of decipher and make sense of words and also visual content, even works in some multimodality. A little bit less effective in terms of analyzing though, because students through these types of activities aren't having the opportunity to question what's learned from the culture or to make those cultural comparisons. So I think that's the piece where language educators can come in, maybe look at this map and then go onto a website that is likely far more up to date. For us in French, we have the International Organization of Francophonie, right? So maybe having students look at the information in the book, look at the information on one web page, and identify any differences that they see in terms of the number of countries, the number of students who speak French or use French in their everyday lives, and then maybe engage in some simple cultural comparisons. This is an area where it also can be useful to use students' first language, if appropriate, to engage in analyzing, depending on the level and depending on instructional priorities. Finally, applying. So applying is typically last in that sequence of the knowledge processes where students are gaining new meaning-making resources, engaging in meaning design through interpersonal and interpretive activities. And then as they come to the end of that sequence, now they're going to apply their knowledge and create a new text or reshape or mode shift with an existing text. So here's an example from the first chapter of that book. And in our case, this final kind of cumulative activity of the first unit of this textbook has students create a short text by writing to what was called almost a decade ago to an electronic pal, to an e-pal, right? Sort of the modern equivalent of a pen pal. Well, this was a great project, and the textbook includes lots of scaffolding of pre-writing activities, of having students brainstorm linguistic available designs, start to organize some of their ideas. And all we've really had to do now is to update the assignment. We actually currently have our students write a Facebook ad or a Facebook post using the conventions of social media among youth. So useful information in the textbook here. We just did a little bit of updating and adapting the textual genre to the type of texts that young people would tend to write in today's world. Okay, I'm going to take a break here, take a breath, let people ask questions or make comments. And Beatrice, did you want to moderate this?
Sure. So we have two questions thus far. Well, since you ended on with applying humanities, someone is asking, in the applying activities, should student create or adapt text using a different modality than the one they read?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in the short answer, I think is yes. Um, the longer, more complicated answer is yes, but yes, but from my experience in language classes and also in teaching writing classes, it's important to provide students textual models for whatever textual genre you will have them create, right? So, for example, I had an article in Calico Journal on digital storytelling and podcasts. And in that project, we had students write a personal story and then also create a podcast style audio recording. In this case, students found it really challenging to mode shift, to go from writing my story to telling my story. So anytime you mode shift and go from one textual genre to another, even if the content is similar, it's going to involve different semiotic modes of meaning making. So you want to be sure to help students get familiar and confident with creating meaning in whatever form is the targeted textual genre.
Great. I'm going to drop in the chat a link to the
Oh,
article you
good.
just mentioned.
Thank
But
you.
in any case, the other question we have is, could there be a concept of multi-fluencies, um, which focuses not so much on understanding, but facility of use and an ability to flow and react in the moment, such as to respond in an internet chat group with a link to a relevant website?
Absolutely. And I think this is a big part of multiple literacies, the idea that communication is not just generic, it is not just standard, but multiliteracies are above anything else situated, right? It's the situation of communication that creates the communicative demands and norms, right? So what is a norm of communication on a webinar meeting like this will vary wildly from what might be the norms of communication by, I don't know, like a group of scientists engaging in a webinar, or a group of people who do knitting and meet up on Zoom, right? So it's the norms of the group and the norms of the community that create the conventions or the norms of how we communicate. And I think that's a very important part of what we should be teaching in the classroom, right? So not just the grammar and not just the vocabulary to make meaning, but to go further than that. And at the heart of it, this was really important in communicative competence as a construct, but it often kind of gets deprioritized in instructional materials.
Yeah. Thank you. So someone is asking, say, I wonder how scaffolding of vocabulary and structures can be created when using mainly authentic materials rather than simplified ones. That is the main setback I have when I want to implement multiliteracies pedagogy.
Absolutely. And the research reflects that, right? That time and the need to put all this scaffolding in place is what is the major constraint. It can be done. I would say follow models. Start with models that have been published, models that you can find in some of the resources that I share at the end, and look at those as best practices. And I'll go ahead and share one of the tips. I always would say start small. Kind of set the bar reasonably for yourself. Let's say if you have a unit, it's going to last 3 or 4 weeks. Aim to weave in one reading-based activity in that unit, not 5. Start small. And as you get more confidence, a little bit like riding a bike, it won't be seamless and it will never take 0 time, but it gets easier as you go. Just start small.
Right. So I think that the next question is something that comes up often, right? Is the multiliteracies framework more relevant when teaching adults than other groups?
Great question, right? Because students' academic literacies are much more developed when we're talking about college level students. But what I will say is this is not a framework that originated from language professors, right? This originated in elementary and secondary contexts, excuse me. And I think it's all about adapting and modifying, meeting your students where they are at with their literacy development, how they can use language, how much academic literacy they currently possess, and building on it. You're not going to be able to do the same thing, at the college level as you can with a second grader, with a 7-year-old. But I think the relevance is still there. The aims are still constant, despite the significant difference in cognitive and linguistic capacities.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question. And others are also very interesting. But this one is actually, how do you apply what you're talking about in asynchronous online courses? And maybe you have examples. Maybe you have a setup like this where you're teaching online courses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Asynchronous with an A?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Asynchronous. Yeah.
Yeah, really good question. So I taught an asynchronous online course using this approach during the pandemic. And I would say it's everything is still relevant and valid, but of course, the lack of the interpersonal group um, communication is what has to be addressed first and foremost. How can you build in opportunities for person-to-person communication if there are no whole class meetings? In my case, we use things like a discussion forum and also a dedicated Instagram account where we connected digitally. And I did require, despite the absence of whole class meetings, one-on-one check-ins with my students for goal setting and feedback. Yeah, because of course, with no communication, spontaneously in language is a real constraint. So thinking about that constraint and how maybe you're not going to negate it, but how can you work with it and how can you make opportunities for meaningful communication, given the goals of the course and the students you're working with.
Maybe we can take one more question and then we'll continue with the rest later. So maybe that's an interesting one too. What role does the teacher's agency play in making a textbook or bringing a textbook, making a textbook work together with meaningful, authentic contextual resources?
Yeah, yeah. The teacher's agency. And I think this is going to come up in the next part of my presentation. But for me, this idea that I discussed earlier of the textbook being an authority or a script, right? That really doesn't make room for teacher agency if we say, well, teaching Spanish 101, here's my book. I'm just going to go through the first 6 chapters. And that's what I need to do in this course. Some people don't have that choice, right? To take away the textbook or to take away textbook content. And there you might be faced with a lack of agency, a lack of instructional decision making. But most people do have some space for agency, right? So there, I think when you do have the opportunity to start with identifying your instructional priorities, what are the goals and objectives for learning that I feel are most important for me and my students, and how can the textbook serve that, right?
Mhm.
Reflecting first and foremost there, starting from that, rather than what is the textbook content. I think that's the first sort of agentic moment is putting yourself in the driver's seat to the extent possible with the course level goals and objectives. Okay. So I'm going to give an instructional example now from our intermediate curriculum. To give you a little bit of context on these courses, these are college level French students. So typically, but not always, 18 to 22-year-olds here in the Midwest US. On the left side of your screen, you see our course level objectives, the areas. These are not the objective statements, but the areas of learning that are prioritized in the course. So first and foremost, communication in French, right? Continuing to advance students' knowledge of vocabulary and grammar. Opportunities for increasing their knowledge of second language cultural practices and perspectives, and for engaging in cross-cultural comparisons. And then finally, opportunities for reflecting on the learning and use of French through things like self-evaluations. Okay, so these are our course level learning objective areas. And what we wanted to try to do would be to find a textbook that aligned reasonably well with carrying out our course level objectives. We knew we would never find a textbook that we could just map onto these and say, we're going to march our way through each chapter and the course is going to teach itself. No, but we did find some materials that we thought were very interesting in the sense of the textbook content, the scope, the amount, the sequence, the sequencing of course content, and how each of the units in this particular textbook were organized. This textbook includes 8 chapters, and it can be used, across intermediate level courses. And the first thing that we did was to ask ourselves, which chapter themes or which units of this textbook did we think would have the most relevance, the most potential for our students to engage in meaning design to help develop their literacies. So out of these 8 chapters, there were a few that for us, we weren't sure that they were up to the task. And for example, chapter 1 had to do primarily with censure and university life. And we thought, well, it could be a little dry, could be a little bit of a tough sell at the beginning of a semester. Maybe we want to start with something more interpersonal. Maybe we want to start with something more relatable for students. So we actually start our intermediate course, our intermediate 1 course with chapter 2. We just set chapter 1 aside. We did look at the conceptualizing activities there and some of the grammatical content that was covered in that chapter. And we simply kind of plucked it out and we found a good place for it in a different unit. So our first intermediate course covers 3 chapters worth of textbook material, chapters 2, 3, and 4 of the book. And then we did a very similar thing in our intermediate French 2 course. We looked at which chapter themes we thought would be the most relevant and meaningful for students. And we eliminated the chapter on the collective good and individual freedom. Interesting topic, something that I would probably be more apt to cover in a little bit higher level course in a cultural studies course. And as you see from my comments already, it's sort of the use of the less is more principle, sort of using our agency here and deciding to cover fewer textbook units to allow for prioritizing textual content and pulling in additional authentic materials. Okay, so the next stage of planning of the course content was planning applying activities, so sort of that backward design idea, right? So where do we want to get at the end of each unit of the course? What do we want students to do with language, to make with language? And you see highlighted in yellow on your screen the sort of end point that we wish students to get to at the end of modules 2, 3, and 4 of this course. And we kind of work backwards, right? After planning where we wanted the endpoint of each unit to be in terms of meaning design and applying activities, then we thought about the sub-themes and the type of texts that we needed to gather, mainly from the internet, but also some literary texts, some things like cartoons, reports, art even, and mapping those into these units. So some general suggestions that I make after taking part in lots of course revisions on multiliteracies pedagogy and textbook oriented courses. The first would be, don't overlook the utility of experiencing activities to sort of launch units of the course and even to launch lessons, to start on sort of common ground, comfortable ground, even when students are a little more advanced and they're engaging with sophisticated cultural topics. It always is an inclusive and I think motivating way to start topics based on students' views, beliefs, lived realities, experiences of the world. As someone mentioned during the Q&A time, experiencing activities that entail authentic texts, not instructional texts, require a lot of scaffolding, really careful scaffolding, not only of unfamiliar vocabulary, but having students think about sort of what are the main ideas or how is the text organized? Scaffolding would also include moving from literal textual meaning to guiding students to read between the lines. That might look like pulling out some quotes and having them interpret it, trying to make connections between different ideas at different parts of texts. And then moving to using textual content, not just to work on reading or listening, but as a springboard for analyzing activities. And these are the ones that are often missing in textbooks, right? Not just read the text, demonstrate that you understand the text, but making space for students to react to textual ideas, to compare them to perspectives and practices in their own cultures. Focusing conceptualizing activities only on the available designs necessary for interpretive and interpersonal communication and for later applying, right? So maybe cutting out some of, for example, grammatical material. Elementary level textbooks in my language tend to really overdo it with first year students, what they include in chapters and as such, implicitly suggest to teachers that students are capable of mastering. I know in one of the textbooks that we've used, students move through no less than 3 or 4 modes and tenses of verbs in perhaps 2 months. That's just not, it's not realistic for students to master that content. So think about sort of, again, in the spirit of backward design, where do you want students to be at the end of the unit or the end of the course? And which lexicogrammatical available designs are needed, are going to be tools for those types of meaning design, and maybe leave some of the textbook grammatical points aside for a later semester. Provide extra support for vocabulary learning. One thing that we've heard from students are that word lists are not enough, and textbook-based vocabulary activities don't tend to help them with long-term retention. One thing that we've done is we have created some Google Doc word lists, and we've had some of our graduate students who are from French-speaking places in the world to narrate those word lists. Using word lists that are instructor generated also gives an opportunity to incorporate slang and informal language to kind of update those word lists from textbooks. So the textbook word list can be a great starting point, but it can also be really nice for teachers and students to complement it and update it. And then finally, for applying activities, allow sufficient class time for pre-writing and pre-speaking workshops. I know that a lot of people are nervous when we increase the attention to meaning design and things like presentational writing or multimodal projects. Well, what about AI? What about students working alone at home on those kind of assignments? Won't they start using Chat GPT? Maybe, but in our experience, when you allow sufficient class time for workshopping, for pre-writing, you give students that linguistic support and cognitive support they need, there's a lot less tendency to use resources that aren't as effective. Okay. This slide is actually just a summary slide for post-webinar use for those of you who might go to the Circle website and download the slides. This is just a summary of some of the ideas that I've shared in the past 10-ish slides. Some final thoughts on integrating multiliteracies and textbook-based language courses. First, recognize that this is a time commitment on anyone's part as a language instructor in going beyond the textbook and integrating multiliteracies pedagogy. My advice after doing this many times over the past 15 years, start with targeted revisions, targeted changes. Maybe think about where are your students at? What feels like it could be more meaningful? What feels like it could be more engaging in your course? What are their communicative needs? And which of those needs do you feel are not best served through the textbook materials? Maybe it would be doing an intervention in terms of writing. Maybe it would be an intervention that relates to culture learning. Maybe you want to beef up reading and authentic texts, but start small. Maybe just one lesson per unit would be a multiliteracy based lesson, and build from there. Related point, find collaborators. Your collaborators might be local. You might have someone in your language department who might be able to pair up with you and develop materials, or maybe not. Maybe you're the only Chinese teacher or the only Italian teacher in your school. Might be going to someone in a different language and seeing if they have a curiosity about this pedagogy and working together. Or it might be a virtual collaborator, but think about how you might be able to use collaboration to help you in these efforts. Don't overlook the importance of students' perspectives, of students' experiences of these pedagogies. There's been research that shows that students can be at times resistant to working with authentic texts, might feel unfamiliar at first. So sort of explaining the why. Why are you using this pedagogy? Why do you want to try this? And give students a voice. Let them talk back when they participate in multiliteracies learning. Might be through a ticket out the door, kind of informal reflection, might be through a self-evaluation, but giving students kind of a place at the table and participating in the pedagogy. And finally, seeking out additional resources for yourself. One webinar will not do the trick in learning multiliteracies. It took me a really long time, probably years, to get really familiar and conversant and confident in working with multiliteracies. The good news is that in 2025, there are a lot of resources, many more than when I started my multiliteracies learning journey over 20 years ago. And I want to end with sharing a few of those resources with you. The resources are almost endless, and I'm just going to share a couple of my favorite ones. One that I quoted several times during the webinar today, and that you see on the right side of your screen, is the 2023 book by Kate Paisani and Mandy Mankey, which is entitled Literacies in Language Education, a Guide for Teachers and Teacher Educators. This is published by Georgetown Press, and there is also a free complimentary resources that go along with this book that are on the CARLA, the Center for Advanced Research and Language Acquisition. which is at University of Minnesota. This is a whole project. So there's lots of free resources that align with the book that you can find. And in the middle of your screen, you have that address. I also wanted to mention that Kate Paisani is holding a workshop on site at University of Minnesota this summer on teaching with multiliteracies and creating text-based instructional materials. So if you do have the possibility of traveling to the Midwest this summer, Kate gives a wonderful workshop. You can also access registration information on the Carla website. And finally, on the left of your screen, the 2022 book by Gabriela Zapata, Learning by Design and Second Language Teaching, is a fantastic resource. This is published by Routledge, and I believe that you have a link to that on the Circle website for this webinar. About 2/3 of Gabriela's book can be downloaded for free. Chapters 1, 2, and 3 out of the 5-chapter book are free. And my favorite chapter of the book, unfortunately, is not free, but there are, I want to tell you, Chapter 5, Sample Second Language Tasks Grounded in Learning by Design. There are something like 60 pages of model resources for working, for creating multiliteracies and design-based materials. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there. We are at, I think we're about an hour and 15 minutes, right, Beatrice? So we have a few more minutes for
That's great.
discussion, questions.
Yes. Um, so I guess maybe sometimes in the presentations things might get lost a little bit. So this person says, well, first, thank you for your nice presentation. Do you think that EFL, ESL books should include critical thinking opportunities? And is that part of multiliteracies?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for this question. I think that critical thinking, cross-cultural content should be a fundamental part of all language courses. And I think it's one of the reasons why in some circles people have devalued language study, right? It's gotten a little bit lost for some of us as educators because we've put so much focus on meeting standards for maybe it's proficiency or competence, sort of over focusing on that linguistic aspect. But the research tells us, for example, in my discipline in French, that even though students might go on to become a French major, do their whole undergraduate degree in French, or even get an MA, master's degree in French, that less than 5% of students with a college degree in French will go on to use that language primarily in their workplace, right? So that means 95% of French majors are going to do something else other than use that language in their workplace. Obviously, that depends on the cultural context. That depends on the language. But what that tells me is we need to shine a much brighter light. We need to spend much more focus on critical thinking, on intercultural competence. If students themselves are not going to be focusing on the linguistic aspect of language learning after their studies. Now, in an ESL and EFL context, that's the other end of the spectrum, right? Students are going on to use that academic content for workplace needs, for graduate students, for graduate studies, etc. But I think that we can accomplish both the critical thinking, the textual thinking, and the cultural learning by weaving together the communicative and the textual, right? By incorporating the texts alongside, the activities that focus on grammatical learning or vocabulary acquisition.
Mhm. Yeah. There's another question, and then after that, this is it pretty much. But what are some suggestions to bridge the gap between using the textbook and using authentic material, especially in the lower level?
Yeah. So we have some examples of that. Beatrice shared just a little bit earlier an article that I wrote with Kate Paisani that appeared in L2 Journal. That's an open source publication, so anyone can download it. You don't need a subscription. And there we gave an example from a first-year course of how you can weave these two things together. I think the way to start is using some of the suggestions that I provided in that second part of the webinar when I was showing you those examples. Sort of use the textbook as a point of departure, as a springboard, identify where the holes are, kind of culturally, as well as in terms of meaning design. In our own program, we use textbook materials for about 2/3 of each unit in French 1 and French 2, right? And after they finish the part of the unit that's more textbook focused, then we have them engaged in additional interpretive communication, multimodal documents, things like infographics, short videos, news reports, and then finish each unit with a project. That's either an oral, multimodal, or writing project. So we leverage the textbook, we use the textbook heavily for conceptualizing and experiencing, and then we know that we will need to create ourselves the analyzing and applying activities.
So a couple more questions have come in, actually. Someone says, how do you, as an instructor, deal with first and second language conflicts as they arise with learners in the process of making meaning in the text? So I think it's really hinging on, the use of two languages or.
Yeah. This is a really good question. And it's a tricky question because, we've been in sort of an ideology now for 20, 30 years of we want things to be meaningful. We want things to be done almost all in the target language. But on the other hand, we have really valuable research that shows the value of translanguaging and using students' first language as a tool for meaning making, as a tool for negotiating meaning. So I think it's about, and this is a journey I'm still on that I'm kind of figuring out myself in the courses I teach and in the courses I supervise, but trying to determine how students L1 can be used, make space for it, communicate that for students where you welcome that, translanguaging or use of the L1 for self-reflection, self-evaluation, and where you don't see it as appropriate. Maybe there are some activities where you want them to use only the second language as much as they are capable.
Yeah. I mean, if I can, one thing that I've been trying as part of a curricular project right now is that maybe for the project, where students might be creating something, talking to a French-speaking audience, but I also want to recognize that the learners in our classes are often multilingual, multicultural learners, right? And so sometimes if they create a video and it's in French, but I invite them to do subtitles, working with colleagues, so maybe in English, but here we are a Hispanic serving institution, so many of our students also might have Spanish in their background. So it's also a way of, they can also translate what they did in Spanish, so therefore sharing what they've done, but also in a way valuing the other languages that they have.
Absolutely, like recognizing their multilingual identities.
Right, yeah.
This is something that I brought in a recent iteration of my creative writing course, in the first discussion board, asking them like, do you read? What do you enjoy reading? Who is your favorite author? Instead of asking them, like, what do you like to read in French? But opening it up to any language, to any kind of writing that they like to read. And the discussion that produced was so much richer when it made space for their multilingualism.
Yes. So one last question, and I think it's probably going to take us to the bottom of the hour. So as a facilitator, I believe in the concept of critical thinking and cognitive analysis. are interdisciplinary subjects related to multiliteracies as well? What are the roles of intercultural? And then another kind of related question, what is the role of intercultural competence in the multiliteracies framework?
Yeah, yeah. So I'm going to start with the last question first, I think. Intercultural competence, I think I see a great deal of overlap with the construct of the sociocultural dimension of literacy, right? The aims are very similar. The ways that those concepts have been defined by various researchers differ in their details, but I think that intercultural competence as a sub-construct or sort of a sub-goal of multiliteracies is completely consistent. Interdisciplinarity, that's a great question. And in the instructional example that I shared, I didn't mention it, and unless you're a French speaker, you might not have even noticed, but one of the topics in the textbook we've been using, it's like scientific controversies, artificial intelligence, and gene editing. So this chapter really made things get real for me in terms of interdisciplinarity, right? And introducing students to interdisciplinary topics like science and technology that maybe students have experienced if they have taken part in like an international baccalaureate or an advanced placement curriculum, but for many of them, it was the first time they had experienced those topics in a foreign language. And I think it made it all the richer, much more challenging in terms of conceptualizing and vocabulary and things like that. But I think interdisciplinarity is a real asset in a multi-literacies course, and it can help take us beyond the normally banal topics or sometimes banal topics that textbooks tend to feature.
Yeah, and I think, we're also trying to, um, you know, promote, foster learners who can actually engage in current debates. So when you mention, artificial intelligence, for example, this is really part of core discussions, whether it's on campus, in schools, from the teaching and the learning thing. So I think that, exposing and having students think about these issues in another language just enriches it in many ways because they might have these conversations elsewhere on campus,
And
right?
to see the links between their academic and professional identities, whether they're STEM major or engineering or that there are some overlaps between what they're learning about in their language course and doing in their academic discipline, other academic disciplines.
Yes, yes. All right. Well, this was our last question. So
Thank
if
you.
anybody is still there, I see still like over 80 people parked. Oh, there's one that just came in. All right. What is this? Oh, so someone, maybe it's more of a comment. It's just, it feels good to know that the way I've been teaching for several years is on target. My students are all artists and our campus is
Oh,
project based. My Japanese
awesome.
courses are always multiliteracy based like this. Thank you.
Right on. One book that I had that I did not incorporate, but for anyone who's in less commonly taught languages, I really enjoyed this book. It's a little older, but it's an excellent book, Multiliteracies in World Language Education from 2016 from Yuri Kumagai, Lopez Sanchez, and Wu. Has some great models for those of you teaching less commonly taught languages of how they've taken up this pedagogy in those courses.
Yes, it's a good book.
I've worn out this book. The spine is well
Yeah, and the
worn.
person who actually asked this or made that comment says, I love this book. So already familiar with it. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for being here.
Yes. Well, thank you for sharing your experience with incorporating multiliteracies in a textbook driven curricula, which is, anyone interested in the framework would struggle doing this with the current state of materials that we have for first and second year language teaching. But I think it gives us lots of ideas in terms of what's present and what really deserves attention in terms of supplementing the materials that we might have around already. So yeah. Yeah.
And I welcome additional questions if people want to reach out to me via email. Maybe I can just put my email in the chat.
Sure.
Let's see.
And I believe your email might be on the Circle web page too. So if anybody
So
wants
if
to know.
anyone has additional questions or wanted more examples, I'm happy to share.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much.